Star of Bethlehem. Let's put ourselves in the mood with a familiar Christmas carol. Okay, we won't have all of that. This is going to be looking at the Gospel of St. Matthew and reminding ourselves of the account there of the Magi and the star in the east. Then we're going to have a think about what astronomical candidates could possibly match up with the account of the Star of Bethlehem. What are the possibilities and how well do they fit the account? And then we'll have a think about the dates. If there are a few candidates, do they actually fit in terms of the timeline, the known events of the timeline of the Nativity? And then I'm going to have a look at some Starry Night software. I would normally run the planetarium software, but with Zoom it's easier to simply show you a few videos of the software running, and we're going to wind the clock back to a few years BC to confirm what was in the sky back then. And then I'll summarise. So let's have a look at the principal elements of Matthew's account, and I'll highlight the 5 things that we're trying to account for. So the Magi, according to the account in the Bible, journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. So the first thing we've got to find is, can we find something that could be interpreted as the star in the east? Note that the Bible doesn't say that they followed the star, so the star appeared in the east and they travelled west. They asked Herod about what's this we learn about the King of the Jews. And Herod was unaware of the star or the interpretation that they put on the star, and they journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the south and then stopped over Bethlehem. So in red there are the 5 things that we are trying to account for. The appearance of a star in the east, the interpretation as to why that star could be interpreted as the birth of the King of the Jews. Is it reasonable that Herod was unaware of this? Could the star reappear in the sky? And how could we think about it stopping over Bethlehem? If we can find some astronomical candidate that hits all of those 5 elements of the account, then maybe we have a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. Let's listen to the words again of the Christmas carol, just the first verse. Sorry if you were just getting going there, but I think we'll kill it at that point. So, we 3 kings of Orient are. When we start unpicking the actual account of St. Matthew, we realise that actually we shouldn't really be singing about we 3 kings of Orient are, because nowhere in the Bible does it talk about 3. There's an indication that there are multiple individuals who come. The adoration of the Magi implies that there are multiple individuals, wise men or Magi if you prefer, but it doesn't actually mention 3 people. It's always assumed that there were 3 Magi or 3 wise men, simply because they mention 3 gifts, the gold, frankincense and myrrh, and if there were 3 gifts brought by the Magi, then presumably there were 3 Magi. Well, that's not necessarily true. There could have been 26 of them, but only 3 brought gifts and the others didn't bring anything because they weren't told to. So we really shouldn't have the word 3 there. We should get rid of that. And they weren't actually kings. Nowhere in the Bible does it refer to kings. It only refers to Magi or wise men. So we shouldn't really be talking about kings either. So we 3 kings of Orient are. We should get rid of the 3 and we should get rid of the kings. And we believe that the Magi came from Well, somewhere further east than Bethlehem, but was that the Middle East? Was it India? Was it Mongolia? Was it the Far East? Well, we don't actually know where it was, so we shouldn't really be talking about the Orient unless we mean the Orient being the entire half of the world further east than Bethlehem. And as I've said on the previous slide, nowhere in the Bible does it talk about them following the star. The star was seen in the east, but then they travelled to the west, so they didn't follow a star. So this particular Christmas carol, you can see, is starting to fall apart very rapidly. We Three Kings of Orient Are has three things that we can't justify in the title. So being a scientist, we want to do this properly, so we really ought to rewrite this Christmas carol, and it ought to go something more like, we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are, who saw a star. And you can see that if physicists write Christmas carols, you can understand why it doesn't meter too well. And again, when we're talking about three wise men, no, we shouldn't talk about three wise men. We should really talk about n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1 and less than infinity. We know it's greater than 1 because the Magi, or the three wise men, is always referred to in the plural. So we know it's more than 1, but we really don't know how many. And when it comes to thinking about the Star of Bethlehem, we should remember that a star doesn't mean a star in the sense that we understand it in the modern astronomical sense. For instance, a wandering star is a name given to one of the stars that is not one of the fixed stars in the constellation, but if they noticed a star that seems to move from day to day, from week to week, and wander through the rest of the fixed stars, then a wandering star is what we would, of course, now call a planet. And also the possibility of a visiting hairy star, a star with a tail. That's, of course, what we would now call a comet. And even today, meteors are sometimes called shooting stars, the colloquial name. So we must remember that although we have particular names, like we would call bright objects maybe a star or a planet or a comet or a meteor, in times of yore, then perhaps they would all be simply referred to as a star. So we should interpret star as meaning something that's seen in the night sky, other than the moon perhaps. So just bear that in mind when we're talking about the Star of Bethlehem. We shouldn't be too literal about it. Do we learn anything by looking at any depictions of the adoration of the Magi in the many centuries since the birth of Christ? Well, here we see Botticelli's painting. Bottom right there, we assume that this individual is Botticelli himself, sort of photobombing his own painting, as it were. We see something that looks like it might be the Star of Bethlehem in the background. It's a little bit difficult to tell exactly what it is. Also in the background there appears to be Joseph, who looks very bored and doesn't appear to be taking any part in the festivities or the celebration here. Maybe that's appropriate because allegedly he didn't take any part in the conception either, so maybe that's all well and good. Are there any other clues in other paintings? Well, here again we see a depiction which could be the Star of Bethlehem in the background there, and in other depictions, well, Giotto is different from many other representations in that here we see what appears to be a comet rather than a star in the sense of a point source of light in the sky. Here we see something that clearly has a tail, and that's interpreted as being the appearance of a comet in the sky. That was Giotto in 1305. Most other representations of the adoration of the Magi seem to take the conventional approach of a star. Here, Rubens, for some reason or another, he's decided not to put the Star of Bethlehem in the sky, as far as I can see, unless it's hidden there in the background somewhere. Maybe it's somewhere behind that two-headed camel, which is an interesting take on the nativity scene there. And again, the conventional representation of what appears to be a point-like source, perhaps with a little bit of light shining down onto the baby Jesus there. And the same for this Van Lint in 1630. Again, a point-like source shining down onto the baby Jesus. It's not surprising that we don't learn anything from paintings like this, because partly they were painted many centuries after the Nativity, and also, of course, this is not an accurate representation of what has happened. It's an artistic representation, and the artist is painting what the viewers expect to see. So the adoration of the Magi is nearly always 3 Magi, because that's simply the convention. And the same is true of the Star of Bethlehem. So what is going to be the astrological significance of what's in the sky? Well, we have to remember that every planet, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation had some sort of astrological significance. So for instance, we can pick out a few that are relevant. So for instance, the appearance of Venus. Venus is associated with beauty and fertility and birth. Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, is associated with royalty and especially is thought of as the king of planets. Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo and is thought of as the king of stars, hence the name Regulus. And the lion itself is often associated with the Lion of Judea, because the tribe of Judea, or the land of Judea, has a flag with a lion on it, and therefore the lion in the sky is often associated with that tribe or that land. Why should people make particular associations between what they see in the sky and particular traits or characteristics or events? Well, that's because it was believed that essentially what you see in the sky is a portent or a foretelling of what's going to happen in the future. You can think of the sky as being God's Facebook page. If something is going to happen, God will paste it up there in the stars, and that will give you an idea of what's going to happen in days or weeks or months to come. That is what you should be doing, looking at the sky night after night, and then you will get an idea of what's in store for you. So that's why astrologers were continually looking at the sky and making particular judgments as to a particular appearance of a particular planet in a particular part of the sky can be interpreted in given ways. So let's have a think about what star candidates might exist. What we're going to do is think of a few possibilities and ask ourselves, does it meet the criterion of being described as a star in the east? Could it be considered significant? Is it reasonable that Herod wasn't aware of this particular star? Is it possible for the star to reappear in the sky? Is it possible for the star to stop in the sky? Those are the 5 elements that we started with in the account according to St. Matthew. So let's have a think about a few possibilities. Is it possible that the Star of Bethlehem was a shooting star? Now we know meteors occur in showers or occasionally swarms. Could you think of a meteor shower as appearing in the east? Well, not really. Meteor showers, the meteors will occur essentially all over the sky. They will appear to radiate from a particular point in the sky, but they will effectively cover the sky. Would they be considered significant? Well, given that you see meteors all the time and showers tend to come round every year, and there's quite a few of them every year, there's no real reason to think of them as being significant in the astrological sense. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of them? Well, yes, if it's not significant, why should he be aware of a particular meteor shower? Is it possible for the star to reappear in the sky? Well, meteors can appear for perhaps a few days or maybe longer, and then they might disappear and the meteor shower will die away, and then later on, a few months, another meteor shower could appear. So yes, a meteor shower, if that's the star, could reappear in the sky. Could it stop in the sky? Well, there's no real way of thinking about a meteor shower where you have shooting stars shooting across the sky. There's no reason to think or to interpret any of them as being stopped in the sky. So meteor showers don't seem to fit. What about the appearance of a comet? Could it appear in the east? It could. Could it be significant? Well, if it's bright enough, it would be considered significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of it? Well, if it's a comet that's bright enough to be significant, it's not obvious why Herod wouldn't be aware of its existence. Could a comet reappear in the sky? Well, yes, comets go around the sun, so it might be for a few months the comet is visible on one side of the sun, and then maybe a little time later it will reappear on the other side of the sun. So yes, that's a possibility. Could a comet stop in the sky? Generally speaking, comets will work their way across the sky. It's unlikely that we could ever interpret it as stopping, though it is conceivable, depending on its orbit, that it might for a while be approaching the Earth and appear to stop in the sky. So perhaps that ought to be a question mark rather than a cross. What about a nova? What about a new star? Strictly speaking, not a new star, but a star that was previously unremarkable, perhaps too faint to see, and then temporarily got rather bright. So could that star have appeared in the east? Well, it's possible for a new star to appear in the east, yes. Would it be significant? Depending on how bright it was, yes. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said star? Again, like the comet, if it's bright enough to be significant, why not bright enough to make sure Herod was aware of it? Well, actually Herod's eyesight wasn't too good, but we're assuming that we're really talking about Herod's astrologers who would be advising him. Could it reappear in the sky? Well, a nova is the brightening of a star, and generally speaking it will then get fainter, and it's possible for that star to get brighter again. But usually that would be many, many years later, and so it doesn't really fit the story of the Nativity. And can the star stop in the sky? Well, a nova is a brightening of a fixed star. It wouldn't be moving relative to the fixed stars, so there would be no reason to talk about it stopping in the sky. So that doesn't seem to fit either. What about a supernova? Well, here we're talking not about a star that just temporarily brightens a little bit. This is a star that's come to the end of its life and has effectively blown itself apart and gets very bright. So depending on the distance of this supernova, it could have been quite a spectacular sight in the sky. Could it have appeared in the east? Yes, they could appear in principle anywhere. Would it have been significant? Certainly if it was close to the Earth, it would have been a very significant event. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said event? Well, again, if it was bright, why wouldn't he be aware of it? Could the star reappear in the sky? Well, it's not obvious how that could happen. If a supernova is a star that's blown itself apart, once it's done that, it can't really do it again. So it doesn't seem that criteria is met. What about the star stopping in the sky? Again, a supernova would appear at a particular point and would appear fixed relative to all of the other fixed stars. So again, why would you talk about it stopping in the sky? So some of those candidates tick some of those boxes, but none of them tick all 5 boxes. I'm leaving the last one till last for perhaps obvious reasons. Could it have been a conjunction of planets? And here I'm using this particular symbol as the astrological symbol of a conjunction. Could it be a conjunction of 2 planets that happen to be in the same part of the sky, and could that happen in the east? Quite definitely it could happen in the east. Could it be significant? Well, the significance depends on which planets, how bright they are, how close they get, and in which constellation they pass each other. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware? Well, it's possible that Herod's astrologers were aware of the event, but didn't necessarily interpret them in the same astrological way. So it is possible that although Herod might have been aware of the existence of a conjunction of planets, he wouldn't necessarily have taken much notice of it. Could it reappear in the sky? Yes, planets are always on the move, and so sometimes they're close together and then they move apart, and sometimes they can get close again some months later. So yes, a conjunction of planets can reappear in the sky. And finally, is it possible for planets to stop in the sky? I'll show a little later that although generally speaking planets go around the sun and they appear to track across our sky from west to east, every once in a while a planet can appear to stop and then go backwards. So yes, it's possible for a planet to stop in the sky. So we now have 5 ticks. It is possible to think about a conjunction of planets as being something that could match all of the criteria in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Let's just have a think about how planets move. So This is just a reminder that if we have two planets at different distances from the Sun, then they go around the Sun at different speeds. Inner planets go faster than outer planets. So at any given time, planets might appear to be in different parts of the sky, but every once in a while, depending on which two planets we're talking about, as seen from the Sun in this case, at this point, those two planets will seem to be in the same part of the sky. That doesn't necessarily mean they are perfectly lined up. In general, planets orbit the Sun, not necessarily in circular orbits, and generally speaking, they are in slightly different planes, and therefore what generally happens is when two planets approach each other in the sky, normally one goes a little bit north or south of the other, so they miss each other, sometimes by a fraction of a degree, sometimes by many degrees. But that's something to bear in mind, that planets are going at different speeds. And that also is relevant to the next point, which is going to become a little clearer later, and that is that if we are observing from a planet like the green planet here, let's imagine that's Earth, and we're looking at a planet that's in an orbit that's outside the orbit of the Earth, so that would be Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, then because the inner planets are moving faster than the outer planets, what that means is, although the outer planet here, let's call it Mars for sake of simplicity, if Mars appears in general to be moving from west to east, if the Earth is going faster than Mars, it can overtake it on the inside, as it were. So just like if you're on a motorway and you're travelling faster than another car, that car appears to you to be moving backwards, even though all the cars are moving forward. So, although all the planets are going around the Sun in the same direction, when the Earth is overtaking on the inside lane, it can make a planet appear to move backwards. So, when traced against the background stars, a planet might appear to move from west to east for a certain length of time, but then stop in the sky and move backwards, and then stop and then move forwards again. This is nothing to do with the motion of the outer planet, it's purely because the Earth is overtaking it, and it's an illusion caused by that overtaking motion. So let's just do that again and remind ourselves that the planets will be moving from west to east for most of the time, but at certain times of the year they will stop in the sky, start to move backwards, stop again, and then continue to move forwards. That little dance they do where the planet seems to move backwards for a while, that's called retrograde motion. And we'll see why that's relevant in a short while. Let's think about the dates. I've got here the timeline from just after 1 BC to about, minus 12 BC. Notice there's no year 0. If you do use planetarium software for looking at what's going on in these years, bear in mind that some planetarium software gets it wrong. If you count backwards through the years, when you go from 2 AD to 1 AD and then go back another year, you should go to 1 BC. Some software incorrectly inserts a year 0, and therefore you'll be off by 1 year if you try and reproduce what I'm showing you here. So there should be no 0, you go straight from 1 AD to 1 BC when you're moving backwards. So, when was Jesus Christ born? Well, a number of people believe he was born somewhere in that block there from about 4 BC to 8 BC, and 6 BC is often quoted as the probable birth date. But that is based on the assumption that King Herod died in 4 BC, and we know that Christ was born shortly before King Herod died, and certainly not after. But there are a number of biblical scholars, and I'm not going to go through the arguments other than to say that it's a little bit tricky to date things 2,000 years ago, because we know that King Herod died a certain length of time after a lunar eclipse. And that lunar eclipse occurred after, who knows what, after a flood or after a famine or some other event was used to date when he died. But some scholars believe that people have been dating Herod's death according to the wrong lunar eclipse, and he didn't die in 4 BC, he actually died in 1 BC, in which case Christ could have been born a few years prior to 1 BC rather than a few years prior to 4 BC. Now, I am no biblical scholar, so I can't really comment on the validity, but it does seem like there's a little bit of an argument as to whether it's 1 or 4 BC. Now, quite why people believe that Christ wasn't born between 3 and 4 BC, I don't know quite, but we're looking at, ideally, the sign of a Star of Bethlehem somewhere in those two grey blocks. So let's just remind ourselves, although we think it might be a planetary conjunction, let's just see, were there any other candidates that were around at the time? Is there any documented evidence for a comet, for instance? Yes, there was. We know that, for instance, there was a comet around in 12 BC. This was Halley's comet. Comets, they're like cats. They have tails and they're unpredictable. So we do know where they are, in the sense that we can wind the clock back and work out where they were in terms of where they were in their orbit. What's very difficult is to work out how bright they would have been, because that's based on how much the sun evaporates the ices in the comet and how long or large a tail is produced and how reflective that tail is. But Halley has been quite a sight for quite a few returns, so it's quite probable that it was quite a sight in 12 BC. But that's a bit early. Why would God post this on his Facebook page so many years before the birth of Christ? That doesn't seem like the right timing. There were comets around in 5 and 4 BC. In 5 BC there was Comet Holmes. Perhaps you remember Comet Holmes. Maybe you photographed it a few years back when the coma expanded quite dramatically over a period of just a day or two. But although that would have been in the right part of the sky, there's no reason to assume that Comet Holmes would have been bright enough to be an interesting object. In 4 BC, another comet. This was Churyumov-Gerasimenko, otherwise known as the Rosetta comet, because it's easier to get your tongue around. So this was the comet that was visited by Rosetta and Philae, and that was around in the right part of the sky in 4 BC, but again, it would be way too faint to be a spectacular object as far as we can tell. So yes, they were there, but no, they wouldn't have been significant. What about nova? A bright nova doesn't happen very often, and apparently there was one in 5 BC and one in 4 BC. That seems very unlikely, unless it's like buses. You wait for a century and then two come along at once. Well, that's possible. But the 5 BC was documented by the Chinese, and the 4 BC nova was documented by the Koreans, neither of which saw the other one. So it seems much more likely that actually there was one nova, it was seen by the Chinese and seen by the Koreans, and maybe we've just got the dates slightly skewed by a few weeks or a few months, and actually they saw the same object. But although there was a nova in the sky, it's not obvious that that would necessarily have met the 5 criterion that we set out to try and explain in the Gospel of St. Matthew. But in terms of conjunctions, now it starts to get interesting. So in around about 6 to 7 BC, there was a conjunction. There's the symbol for conjunction. There was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. The symbols are down here if you've forgotten. I'm using the astrological symbols. So there was a conjunction here, and some people believe it was that conjunction around about 6 BC that was the Star of Bethlehem. But I think it's much more interesting to look at what's going on over here, because there was a conjunction, or actually multiple conjunctions, between Jupiter and Venus in around 2 to 3 BC. So this is why it's important when Herod died, because this conjunction wouldn't be relevant if Herod died in 4 BC, because this would have been after his death and would have been after the birth of Christ. So let's have a look at what I'm talking about when I say this is a very interesting conjunction here. Let's look at a few video clips taken from Starry Night. So you probably can't read all the details, so let me tell you what's going on here. I've set the clock to August of 3 BC. And I don't know where we should be looking in terms of, I don't know where the Magi came from. I don't know if it was India or Mongolia or the Far East. So to get rid of any geographic bias, I've simply asked, what do the planets look like as seen from the centre of the Earth? So that will be wrong by a few thousand miles, but over the distances we're talking about, that should be fine. So it's August of 3 BC at about tea time, at about 20 past 6. And I'm looking at, clearly, a fairly large chunk of sky here. I'm looking at the constellation of Leo, the constellation of Cancer. There's Gemini just peeking in there. And what I'm not going to do is to show day and night and I'm not going to show the horizon, because if I do fast forward and everything starts to move, then the horizon moves all over the place and day and night start to flash by, etc. Also, I am not going to label everything, because if I label everything, and as the planets move through the zodiacal constellations, if every dot that moves has got a label on it big enough for you to read, then all of those labels get very messy. So I've only labelled the constellations in the background, and when I'm going to show this video, I'm going to stay staring in this direction. I'm not staring at a particular part of the sky or a particular elevation. I'm staring at the constellations of Cancer and Leo for reasons that will become apparent. And I've only labelled the planet Jupiter for simplicity. Okay, so it's August of 3 BC, and I'm now going to run the video to run the clock forward. At the moment, we have the constellation of Leo, and there's the star Regulus. We have Jupiter, and the planet that's coming up behind it is Venus. Venus, of course, is closer to the Sun, so is going faster. So Jupiter will move relatively slowly. Venus will move relatively quickly. So let's just run on and see what happens. What we see is that the planet Venus gets very close to the planet Jupiter, and this is August the 12th, 3 BC. Now, when I say close, I mean, remember the size of the full moon, if we use that as a reference, the diameter of the full moon is about ½ a degree. And when Venus and Jupiter get close together here, they are a fraction of a degree apart. So it'll be quite spectacular. Remember, Venus is quite bright. It's about magnitude -4 at this particular point. Jupiter is not quite as bright as that, but they are both very bright stars. And they are getting to within less than the diameter of the full moon from each other. They're still appearing as 2 points of light. Anybody with decent eyesight will be able to still see them as 2 points of light, but they will be quite close together in the sky, so it'll be quite noticeable. So this particular conjunction, which happens in the east in the sense that the Sun is close by, so this particular conjunction would be visible as a bright star in the morning just before sunrise. So a star in the east, the bright Venus and the bright Jupiter. Venus, remember, is associated with birth. Jupiter is associated with royalty and explicitly king. And this conjunction occurs in the constellation of Leo, and Leo is associated with the line of Judea. So one way of interpreting what we see here, a very bright, close conjunction of two bright planets in the east, is Venus, Jupiter in Leo. Birth, king, Jew. So this could be interpreted as something interesting is going to happen, and it's related to the birth of the King of the Jews. Right. So the astrologers now think, hey, God is telling us something interesting is about to happen. Let's keep watching the sky and see what happens. Let's run the clock forward for a few more months. Venus disappears out of the way, but look what's happening here. Jupiter is getting very close to Regulus. Jupiter is in conjunction with Regulus, the king of planets, just past the king of stars. Jupiter is moving from west to east, but it's now going to stop in the sky. At about now, Jupiter has stopped and is now starting to move backwards. Remember this retrograde motion because the Earth is overtaking it on the inside lane. So Jupiter is now moving backwards, and the king of planets is now passing the king of stars again. Another close conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. And what happens? Jupiter stops in the sky again and now starts moving forward one more time. Remember this sort of S shape. And Jupiter is now passing Regulus a third time. So Jupiter passing Regulus is not that unusual, but in the last few months, the king of planets has passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over a period of a few months. We're now at May of 2 BC. So something interesting is happening with kings. One king is dancing around another king. Is the crown of one king being passed to another king? Something interesting is going on, and the astrologers are now starting to get very excited that something very interesting and very big is about to happen. All they need to know is when. What's the starting pistol for telling them now is the time to actually go and see what's going on involving this birth of the King of the Jews. So what happens after Jupiter has passed Regulus? Well, Venus has gone all the way round and is coming back again. So what happens in the next month or so is particularly interesting. Jupiter moves away from Regulus and now Venus is coming up behind it. And Venus now is in another conjunction with Jupiter. But this one is very, very close. Remember the last one, they got within the diameter of the full moon, which would have been interesting, two bright points in the sky quite close together. But in this case, the conjunction between Venus and Jupiter was very close. Let me show you just how close. Let me center Jupiter up in the middle of the field. And now we're going to zoom in to see how close. Of course, there were no telescopes in these days, but we're going to zoom in just so you can see the scale of how close they were. That's how close Jupiter and Venus got in the sky. In this particular piece of software, Venus is not shown with its brilliant white cloud cover. They're showing you the surface of Venus, the volcanoes. So just imagine that it wouldn't actually look like that. It would be a brilliant white object which is so close to Jupiter they would not appear as separate objects. This particular field of view is no more than 1 arc minute from top to bottom. So as far as I can tell, no human has got the visual acuity to be able to separate those 2 points of light, especially because they're such bright points of light. Again, Venus would be about magnitude minus 4.3, I think it was at the time, and Jupiter would have been not quite as bright, but 2 very bright points in the sky that would have been seen to merge into a single, even brighter point on the day of, where are we, 17th of June 2 BC at 6:20 in the evening. So that they would have seen these come together over a few days, and on this particular day they would have merged into a single point of light. How often do you get a conjunction that close? Well, I'm not absolutely sure, but I'd be surprised if a conjunction this close happens more often than a small number of times every 1,000 years. So I think it's safe to say that when the astrologers saw these 2 points of light merge into a single point of light, it is very probable that they had never seen anything like it before. And it's possible that in living memory, even stories passed down from other people, they would not have known about the existence of a conjunction that was that close. So again, this conjunction occurs in the constellation of Leo. So again, we've got Venus, Jupiter in Leo. We've got birth of the King of the Jews with an absolutely spectacular conjunction. We had a heads up last year. Then we had the triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus, the 2 kings. And now we have another conjunction of Jupiter with Venus in the constellation of Leo. That could have been the starting pistol that told the Magi, why are you still here? Why aren't you on your way west to the land of Judea to pay homage to the new King of the Jews? So let's just remind ourselves of those steps. 3 BC in August was the first conjunction of Jupiter with Venus in the constellation of Leo. That was the first heads up, birth of the King of the Jews. And then a few months later, the King of Planets passed the King of Stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the period of a few months. Maybe this was the transfer of the crown from one king to another. And then there was the ridiculously close conjunction of, again, Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo. That perhaps was the starting pistol that told them it's about time you went to the land of Judea. What happened thereafter? Well, we don't know how long it took the Magi to go from wherever they were, their homeland, to Bethlehem. We don't know if they had a short walk or a very long walk or whether they used camels, so we've got no idea if it took weeks or months to get from A to B. It is possible that they set off in June of 2 BC, and it's possible that they took a few months before arriving at Bethlehem. I've got that last box labelled December. This is just pure speculation. If it did take them a few months, they might have arrived in December. What happened in December? Jupiter stops in the sky once more. It goes through another retrograde loop. So in December, Jupiter stops in the sky. So they've had all of these signs, and then when they arrive in Bethlehem, the star is there and the star stops in the sky. Which particular day is it that the star stops in the sky? Well, if you run the astronomical software and check when does Jupiter actually start its retrograde motion, the day actually is the 25th of December. That's pure fluke. We know that the 25th of December, that's just the Christians taking a pagan festival for the end of the longest night, etc., the end of winter, and that's been taken over. So by pure fluke, Jupiter happens to stop in the sky on December the 25th, and maybe that was when the Magi arrived. So we know what happened, and underneath that is an interpretation of how it could be taken by astrologers. Maybe it was these conjunctions of Jupiter with Venus in the constellation of Leo that inspired the account, the story of the Star of Bethlehem, the account that we read in the Gospel of St. Matthew. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was a different astronomical event, or perhaps a combination of events that occurred within a few months that inspired the story of the Star of Bethlehem. Determining the astronomical facts is not that difficult. It's quite easy to take pretty much any piece of software and say, where are the planets now, and dial it back 2,000 years and ask, where were the planets 2,000 years ago? The astronomical facts are easy to determine. Second-guessing the significance that the Magi or other astrologers would have attributed to those events, that's a different matter. That arguably is pure speculation. And this speculation happens to fit some of the account, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily true. Regardless, the underlying message is of course the same at this time of year. Merry Christmas everybody, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.